The sky above Westbrook was painted in shades of gold and crimson, the sun slowly sinking below the horizon. It was a town suspended between old traditions and a new world struggling to encroach upon its quiet streets. From its cobblestone alleys to the solitary diner at the edge of town, Westbrook was the kind of place that had stood still, untouched by time or modern anxieties. But something about that evening felt different, a charged anticipation in the air, something that whispered of imminent disruption. Sergeant David Calloway sat in his patrol car at the far end of the parking lot of the local mall, eyes drifting from one car to the next. He'd been on the force for nearly 15 years, and this was how most of his evenings went, patrolling, watching, waiting for something to break the monotony of small-town law enforcement. Nothing ever did. His days of excitement and ambition had long since been worn down by the grind of the same routine. Tonight, though, there was something that nagged at him. Across the lot, he'd noticed a black SUV parked for over 20 minutes, just sitting there. A sense of unease prickled at the back of his neck. Maybe it was nothing, a shopper finishing a late meal or making a phone call. But something in Calloway's gut told him otherwise. He sighed, rubbing his face, weary from a day of endless routine. He clicked his radio, calling it in out of habit more than suspicion. "This is Calloway, checking out a vehicle. Black SUV, parked near the west entrance, over." The reply was swift but routine, barely registering. As he stepped out of the patrol car, Calloway adjusted his utility belt, his fingers brushing against the cold steel of his holstered weapon. It was one of those days when everything seemed off, a strange energy that made him feel like something was waiting just around the corner. He approached the SUV cautiously, the evening breeze carrying the distant sounds of traffic and the low hum of the mall's air conditioning units. As he neared the vehicle, he noticed a figure sitting inside, still, watching something on a phone. Calloway's instincts kicked in. He knocked gently on the window. The figure looked up, a man in his late 40s, calm but slightly annoyed, as if he'd been interrupted. He wore a simple dark jacket, his posture casual yet composed. There was nothing about him that screamed threat, but there was something about his presence that made Calloway's senses go on high alert. The window rolled down. "Yes, officer?" the man asked, his voice steady and calm, though there was an undertone of annoyance. "Evening," Calloway said, keeping his tone neutral but firm. "We've had reports of a vehicle matching yours parked here for a while. Just doing a routine check. Is everything all right?" The man sighed, as though this was something he'd expected but didn't appreciate. "Everything's fine, officer. I'm just taking a break before heading home. No need for concern." Calloway scanned the man's face, searching for any flicker of deception. His training had taught him to read people quickly, and though the man appeared calm, there was something unsettling in the way he maintained eye contact, as though he was waiting for something else to happen. "You mind showing me some ID?" Calloway asked, keeping the conversation light but professional. The man hesitated for just a fraction of a second, a hesitation so slight that it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But Calloway saw it, and his pulse quickened. "Of course," the man said, reaching into his jacket. His movements were slow and deliberate, but Calloway's hand instinctively moved toward his holster, just in case. The man handed over his driver's license, and Calloway glanced at it. "Jeremy Stokes," he read aloud, nodding slightly. The name didn't trigger any red flags, but that nagging feeling in Calloway's gut wouldn't go away. "Just stay put while I run this," Calloway said, stepping back toward his patrol car. As he walked away, his mind raced with questions. Was this just another uneventful encounter, or was something else at play? As he ran the man's ID, the radio crackled to life again. "Calloway, anything suspicious?" He hesitated before answering. "Not sure yet. Running the ID now." But as the system processed the information, nothing alarming came up. Stokes had no priors, no outstanding warrants, just a clean record for an ordinary citizen. Calloway's grip on the radio tightened, unsure of why he still felt that something was wrong. When he returned to the SUV, Stokes had turned off his phone and was sitting quietly, hands resting on the steering wheel as though waiting for the inevitable questions. Calloway handed back the ID, studying the man's face once more. "All clear," Calloway said, but the words felt hollow. "Sorry to bother you." Stokes gave a tight-lipped smile. "No problem, officer. Just doing your job." As Calloway turned to walk away, a thought struck him, an impulse he couldn't shake. He glanced back over his shoulder, and something in Stokes's demeanor had changed. The man's posture, which had seemed relaxed a moment ago, was now tense, rigid, and Calloway saw it, the flicker of something in Stokes's eyes, something cold and calculating, like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. It was as if the man was playing a part, and now that the performance was over, the real Jeremy Stokes was emerging. "Hey, one last question," Calloway said, turning back toward the SUV, his tone casual. "What exactly were you doing here for so long? Just seems like an odd place to sit for 20 minutes. For a moment, the tension in the air thickened. Stokes's eyes darkened, and the smile faded from his lips. Then, with chilling calmness, Stokes spoke. "I was waiting for you, Officer Calloway." For a moment, everything stopped. Calloway's mind raced, the weight of Stokes' words hanging in the air like a storm cloud ready to break. "Waiting for me?" The words played over and over in his head, like a riddle with no answer. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. This wasn't just another random stop. Suddenly, the quiet suburban evening felt dangerous, like a fuse had been lit beneath the surface of Westbrook. "Waiting for me?" Calloway repeated, keeping his voice steady, though his pulse quickened. His hand hovered near his holster again, but he didn't want to make a move too soon. Stokes's face remained impassive, as though he hadn't just said something deeply unsettling. His hands, still resting on the steering wheel, were perfectly still. "You seemed like someone worth meeting," Stokes said smoothly, his voice unsettlingly calm. "It's not every day you get to meet someone who's seen as much as you have." The words hit Calloway hard, but he didn't flinch. What did this man know about him? He hadn't given anything away, hadn't said anything that could have revealed personal details. But something in Stokes' eyes told him this wasn't a random encounter. It had been planned. "What are you talking about?" Calloway asked, his voice low, now laced with the suspicion that had been gnawing at him from the start. Stokes tilted his head slightly, as though considering his next words carefully. "Let's just say I've done my research. You're not just any small-town cop, are you, Sergeant Calloway?" Calloway's stomach twisted. How did Stokes know his rank? His fingers itched to reach for the radio and call for backup, but he held back, not wanting to tip his hand too soon. "You've made a name for yourself in this town," Stokes continued, his tone conversational, as though they were old friends. "Solving all those little cases, keeping the peace. It must be exhausting. Always being the one in control." Calloway felt his muscles tense. He wasn't used to feeling out of control, but this man, this calm, calculating man, was pushing him toward the edge of something he didn't understand. He needed to get answers, and fast. "I think it's time for you to step out of the car," Calloway said, his voice firm but measured. He kept his hand on the butt of his gun, ready for anything. Stokes didn't move. His eyes locked onto Calloway's, and the corners of his mouth twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Do you really want to do that, Sergeant? Think carefully before you escalate this." The threat was subtle, but it was there, hidden beneath the veneer of politeness. Calloway's instincts screamed at him that this was far more dangerous than he had initially realized. Every fiber of his being was on high alert now. Calloway made a decision. "Step out of the car, now." For the first time, Stokes's expression shifted, a flicker of something like disappointment crossing his face. But then he moved, slowly, deliberately, opening the door and stepping out of the SUV. He stood tall, his posture relaxed but controlled, as though he had done this before. Calloway took a step back, giving himself space, his hand still hovering over his holster. His heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Something was very wrong here, and he needed to figure out what before it spiraled out of control. Stokes stood in front of him, calm and composed, as though this were all part of a game he had been playing for a long time. "You're not going to find what you're looking for," Stokes said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean?" Calloway demanded. Stokes smiled again, that cold, calculated smile that sent chills down Calloway's spine. "You'll see. Soon enough. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, share it with others, and let us know your thoughts or experiences in the comments below. Your voice matters." Sergeant David Calloway stared at Jeremy Stokes, his hand hovering near his holster, a cold sweat running down his spine. This wasn't just a routine stop anymore. This man, whoever he was, had turned the tables, taken control of the situation in a way that Calloway hadn't anticipated. Stokes complied, turning around and putting his hands behind his head, but the casual confidence in his demeanor made the gesture feel hollow. It was as if he was indulging Calloway, playing along with the show of authority, but beneath it, there was something else, something dangerous. "I'm going to ask you one more time, Calloway said, his voice strained but steady. "What were you doing here? Why were you waiting for me?" Stokes was silent for a moment, and Calloway could almost hear the gears turning in the man's head, as if he were deciding how much of the truth to reveal. Then, in that same unnervingly calm voice, Stokes replied, "You're part of a puzzle, Sergeant Calloway, one that's been in motion long before you even realized it." The cryptic statement hit Calloway like a gut punch. His mind raced, trying to piece together what Stokes could mean. Puzzle? What puzzle? He didn't understand, and the frustration gnawed at him. "I don't have time for games," Calloway snapped. "If you don't start talking sense, I'm arresting you right now." Stokes slowly turned his head, just enough to meet Calloway's gaze over his shoulder. His eyes were dark, unreadable, but there was something almost amused in his expression. "You think arresting me will fix this? You're in deeper than you know, Sergeant. There are things happening around you, right here in Westbrook, that you can't even begin to comprehend." Calloway's heart pounded harder now. Was Stokes threatening him? Was this some kind of warning? The man spoke with such conviction that it sent a chill down Calloway's spine. "What are you talking about?" Calloway demanded, his voice harder now, more desperate. He needed to regain control of the situation before it spiraled even further out of his grasp. Stokes smiled, a slow, unsettling smile that sent Calloway's instincts into overdrive. "You'll find out soon enough, but by then, it might be too late." Before Calloway could respond, Stokes suddenly lunged forward, not toward Calloway, but toward the open door of his SUV. It was a calculated move, fast and deliberate, catching Calloway off guard for a split second. Without thinking, Calloway's reflexes kicked in. "Freeze!" he shouted, his hand flying to his gun as he pulled it from its holster. But it was too late. Stokes had already reached into the SUV and pulled something from the glove compartment, a small black notebook. He held it up in the air, his movements slow and non-threatening, but Calloway's adrenaline was surging, his finger hovering over the trigger. "What the hell is that?" Calloway barked, his gun trained on Stokes, every muscle in his body taut. Stokes turned slowly, holding the notebook in front of him, as if offering it up like a peace offering. "It's not a weapon, Sergeant," he said calmly. "It's the key to understanding everything." Calloway's eyes flickered between the notebook and Stokes, his mind racing. He didn't trust this man. Everything about him set off alarm bells, but he couldn't shoot an unarmed man holding a notebook. And yet, something about the way Stokes held it, the way he looked at Calloway, made him feel like this moment was far more dangerous than it seemed. "Drop it," Calloway ordered, his voice trembling slightly, though he tried to hide it. Stokes didn't drop it. Instead, he took a small step forward, holding the notebook out as if he were offering Calloway a choice. "This is what you're looking for," Stokes said quietly. "Everything you've been questioning, everything that's felt wrong about this town, this will explain it." Calloway's stomach twisted. How did Stokes know about his doubts, about the sense of unease he had been feeling for months, the nagging suspicion that something was off in Westbrook? He hadn't voiced those concerns to anyone, not even his partner. But here was this man, a stranger, standing in front of him, speaking as if he knew exactly what was going on in Calloway's head. "Drop the notebook, now," Calloway repeated, louder this time, his gun still trained on Stokes. His mind was screaming at him to take control, to arrest this man and figure out what was happening. But his instincts were telling him something else, that this was bigger than him, bigger than anything he had ever dealt with. Stokes remained still, his eyes locked on Calloway's. "You're not ready for the truth," he said, almost sadly. "But when you are, you'll come looking for this." Without another word, Stokes dropped the notebook at his feet and stepped back, raising his hands in surrender. Calloway stared at the notebook, his gun still aimed at Stokes, but his mind now consumed by a torrent of questions. What was in that notebook? What did Stokes mean by the truth? Was this all some elaborate setup, or was there really something darker lurking beneath the surface of Westbrook? The silence stretched between them, thick with tension, as Calloway wrestled with the decision in front of him. Then, finally, he holstered his weapon. "Turn around," Calloway ordered, stepping forward with his cuffs ready. "You're under arrest." Stokes didn't resist. He turned slowly, his hands still raised, as Calloway moved to cuff him. But as Calloway secured the handcuffs around Stokes's wrists, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made a mistake, that he had just set something in motion that couldn't be undone. Stokes, his face calm as ever, glanced over his shoulder at Calloway as he was led toward the patrol car. "You're making the wrong move, Sergeant," he said softly, "but don't worry, you'll understand soon enough." Calloway didn't respond. He pushed Stokes into the back of the car, shut the door, and turned back to where the notebook lay on the ground, its pages fluttering slightly in the evening breeze. For a long moment, Calloway stood there, staring at the notebook, his mind racing with the implications of everything that had just happened. Then, slowly, he bent down and picked it up. As he held it in his hands, a sense of dread settled over him. Whatever was inside this notebook, it was about to change everything. Sergeant David Calloway sat at his desk in the dimly lit station, the weight of the black notebook resting heavily in his hands. The small, unassuming object had taken on a new significance, one that he couldn't shake no matter how much he tried to tell himself this was all just a game, a ruse orchestrated by Jeremy Stokes. But his gut told him otherwise. The questions Stokes had raised, the cryptic warnings, it all felt too real, too deliberate. He flipped through the pages, his fingers tracing over the handwritten notes, diagrams, and names scrawled in neat, precise lettering. The deeper he went, the more a gnawing feeling of unease took hold. There were dates and times, locations around Westbrook, places Calloway knew well but had never thought twice about. And then there were the names, familiar names, people in positions of power, people he had worked with, trusted. His breath hitched as he came across his own name, neatly underlined on one of the pages. What the hell was this? His hands trembled slightly as he skimmed through the list of events documented in the notebook, each one marked by dates that coincided with unexplained occurrences around town. Strange disappearances, hushed cover-ups, a network of secrecy that stretched far beyond anything Calloway had ever imagined. And it wasn't just coincidence. This was intentional. It seemed like every instinct he had was screaming at him to stop, to put the notebook away and forget everything he had just seen. But he couldn't. He had to know more. One entry caught his eye, a note about a meeting that was supposed to take place that very night, in a secluded warehouse on the outskirts of town. The names attached to the meeting were people of influence in Westbrook, including figures in law enforcement, politics, and even local businesses. Calloway felt his pulse quicken. What was going on here? Was this some kind of conspiracy? Was Stokes involved, or was he trying to expose it? The thought of heading to the warehouse alone sent a chill down his spine. But Calloway knew he couldn't ignore this. If there was even a fraction of truth in this notebook, he had to follow the lead. He stood, grabbed his keys, and tucked the notebook under his arm, the weight of it feeling like an anchor dragging him down into something far darker than he was prepared for. Sergeant David Calloway crouched low behind a row of abandoned cars, his gaze fixed on the dilapidated warehouse looming ahead. The notebook in his jacket felt heavier than ever, as though it were dragging him down into the dark reality it had revealed. The eerie silence surrounding the building heightened the tension in the air, making every creak of the wind seem like a warning to turn back. But Calloway couldn't turn back now, not after what he had seen. The names, the locations, the meetings, it all painted a picture of corruption, a web of secrecy woven into the very fabric of Westbrook. And tonight, he was about to step into the heart of it. His mind raced as he considered his options. Back up? No. He couldn't trust anyone right now, not after seeing the names in the notebook. Some of the people he'd considered allies, fellow officers, city officials, they were all listed, all part of whatever conspiracy Stokes had hinted at. Taking a deep breath, Calloway moved carefully toward the warehouse, keeping to the shadows as much as possible. His heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to stay focused. He needed answers, and they were inside that building. He reached the side of the warehouse, pressed his back against the cold metal, and listened. Faint voices drifted through the cracks in the structure, the kind of low, serious murmurs that told him this was no ordinary meeting. His fingers tightened around the grip of his gun as he edged closer to a broken window, peering inside. The interior was dimly lit by a single hanging light bulb, casting long shadows across the space. A group of men stood around a large table in the center of the room, their faces partially obscured by the darkness. Calloway recognized some of them immediately, powerful men in Westbrook, men with influence, and there, standing among them, was Jeremy Stokes. Calloway's breath hitched. He wasn't surprised, but the confirmation sent a fresh wave of dread washing over him. Stokes was involved in this conspiracy, just as he had suspected. But what was his role? And why had he approached Calloway, warning him about something much larger at play? Calloway strained to hear what they were saying, but the words were muffled, distorted by the distance and the building's thick walls. He needed to get closer. With deliberate caution, Calloway moved around the side of the building, inching toward a partially open door at the back. Every nerve in his body was on high alert, his senses tuned to the slightest sound. He couldn't afford to be seen, not yet. As he reached the door, he hesitated. Was he ready for what he might uncover? Was he prepared to face the truth, no matter how deep the corruption went? His mind flashed back to the notebook, to his own name scrawled among the others. Whatever this was, he was already implicated. There was no turning back now. With a quiet exhale, Calloway slipped through the door. Inside, the air was thick with tension. The voices were clearer now, their conversation laced with urgency and secrecy. Calloway crouched behind a stack of crates, his eyes scanning the room for any sign that he'd been noticed. So far, no one had seen him. From his vantage point, he could finally make out some of the conversation. "We need to move faster," one of the men said, his voice gruff and commanding. "The authorities are starting to ask questions. If we don't control the narrative, we'll lose everything." "They won't ask questions if we keep them in line," another man replied, his tone cold and calculating. "We have people in the right places. They won't dare step out of line." Calloway's stomach turned. They were talking about controlling the authorities, about silencing anyone who might get too close. He felt a surge of anger rising in his chest. This was worse than he had imagined. Westbrook wasn't just corrupt. It was being manipulated by people who thought they were untouchable. But then, Stokes spoke, and his words cut through the room like a blade. "What about Calloway?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with a hidden edge. "He's already suspicious. He's too close to figuring things out." Calloway's blood ran cold. They knew. They knew he had been digging, that he was onto them, and now they were discussing how to deal with him. "We'll handle him," the gruff-voiced man replied. "He's just one cop. If he gets in the way, we'll make sure he's taken care of." The casualness of the threat sent a chill down Calloway's spine. He had always known that standing up to corruption was dangerous, but hearing his fate discussed so matter-of-factly was something else entirely. But Stokes wasn't done. "No," he said, his tone firmer now. "We don't need to take him out, at least, not yet. He's more valuable alive. We can use him." "Use me?" Calloway's mind reeled. What did they mean by that? Why would Stokes want to keep him alive, especially after all the trouble he had caused by investigating? Stokes continued, "He's still useful. We can control him, steer him in the direction we need. If he becomes a problem, then we'll deal with him." Calloway's fists clenched. Control him? They thought they could manipulate him, turn him into one of their pawns. Not a chance. He had heard enough. With every fiber of his being on edge, Calloway slipped back toward the door, his mind racing with what he had just uncovered. He needed to get out of there, needed to figure out his next move before they realized he had been listening. But as he turned to leave, the floorboard creaked beneath his foot, a small, almost imperceptible sound. But in the silence of the warehouse, it was like a gunshot. The conversation inside stopped. Calloway froze, his heart hammering in his chest. "Did you hear that?" one of the men asked. There was a moment of tense silence. Then, in a low, dangerous voice, Stokes said, "Find him." The word "run" screamed through Calloway's mind, his body already reacting before his brain could fully process the situation. He dashed toward the exit, his boots barely making a sound on the dusty floor as he pushed through the door and back into the cool night air. Behind him, he heard the shouts of the men inside the warehouse, the sound of chairs scraping back, footsteps thundering across the floor. They were coming for him. His pulse pounded in his ears as he sprinted toward the cover of the trees that lined the outskirts of the warehouse. The moon hung high in the sky, casting long, jagged shadows that made the landscape seem more menacing than ever. Calloway's breaths came in short, ragged gasps, his body fueled by adrenaline. He needed to disappear. Fast. Darting between trees, he risked a glance back toward the warehouse. The door had burst open, and two figures emerged, flashlights sweeping across the darkened landscape. Their beams cut through the shadows like searchlights, probing the area for any sign of him. Calloway ducked low, pressing himself against the thick trunk of a tree, his heart thundering in his chest. He couldn't afford to be caught, not now, not when he was so close to uncovering the truth. But every instinct told him that the men hunting him wouldn't hesitate to silence him for good. As the beams of light moved dangerously close to his hiding spot, Calloway cursed himself for not calling for backup earlier. But who could he trust? The notebook had revealed the corruption ran deep, possibly even to the highest levels of the department. He couldn't risk involving anyone else until he knew for sure who was clean. The voices of the men grew louder, their footsteps crunching through the underbrush as they fanned out to search the area. Calloway's grip tightened around the notebook, knowing that it was the key to everything. The evidence inside could expose them all, but only if he could get out of there alive. His mind raced, calculating his next move. He needed to get to his car, but it was too far away. If he made a break for it now, he'd be an easy target. He needed to buy himself some time, create a distraction, something to draw them away from his location. As the beams of the flashlights swept past him again, Calloway spotted a pile of debris not far from where he crouched, a rusted metal barrel and some broken wooden planks. An idea formed in his mind, and he knew it was risky, but it was his only shot. Slowly, carefully, he reached down, picked up a small rock from the ground. His muscles tensed as he waited for the right moment. The flashlights moved away again, and Calloway hurled the rock toward the debris with all his strength. The rock struck the barrel with a loud clang, sending an echo through the night. The response was immediate. "There!" one of the men shouted, his flashlight swinging toward the noise. Calloway didn't wait to see what happened next. The moment the flashlights moved away from his position, he bolted, keeping low as he darted through the trees. His lungs burned, and his legs screamed in protest, but he forced himself to keep moving. He couldn't afford to stop. The sound of the men's voices faded behind him, the distraction buying him precious seconds. But he knew it wouldn't last long. They would figure out the trick soon enough and be back on his trail. He needed a plan, something that would get him out of this alive and with the evidence intact. Suddenly, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Calloway's pulse spiked as he fumbled to pull it out, his hands slick with sweat. It was a text message from an unknown number. "Trust no one. They're everywhere." Calloway's heart raced as he stared at the message. Who had sent it? And how did they know what was happening? Was this another part of Stokes' twisted game, or was someone else trying to help him? He didn't have time to figure it out now. He needed to survive. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, share it with others, and let us know your thoughts or experiences in the comments below. Your voice matters. The message on Calloway's phone buzzed in his mind long after he read it. Trust no one. They're everywhere. The words felt like a death sentence, a confirmation that everything he thought he knew was a lie. He couldn't shake the idea that the web of conspiracy stretched farther than he had initially suspected. Whoever sent the message was either warning him or manipulating him. He wasn't sure which. Calloway crouched behind an abandoned shed, deep in the woods behind the warehouse. His lungs burned from running, and his heartbeat pounded in his ears. The notebook, now crumpled and stained from his escape, was tucked safely inside his jacket. Every muscle in his body ached, but he couldn't stop. His mind was racing. He needed a plan. The footsteps of his pursuers had faded, but they wouldn't be far behind. He knew he had to get out of these woods. But where could he go? Who could he trust? The answer hit him with a jolt of clarity. Nowhere, no one. He was on his own. His only option was to get out of Westbrook and deliver the notebook to someone outside the town, someone who could blow the whistle without being part of the corrupt system that had taken root here. But first, he had to survive the night. Calloway forced himself to move, slipping deeper into the woods, his eyes scanning the shadows for any signs of movement. The trees loomed around him like sentinels, casting long, ominous shadows. The air was thick with tension, and every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig sent his pulse racing. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he spotted something. Movement. Calloway froze, his breath catching in his throat. He crouched lower, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun. The figure moved silently through the trees, and as it stepped into the moonlight, Calloway's heart skipped a beat. It was Stokes. Jeremy Stokes moved with the quiet confidence of a predator, his posture relaxed but alert, as if he were in complete control. He hadn't spotted Calloway yet, but he was getting closer. Calloway's grip tightened on his gun, his mind racing. He could take Stokes out now, end this nightmare before it got any worse. But something stopped him. Stokes had the answers. He knew more than anyone else about what was happening in Westbrook, and if Calloway killed him, he'd lose that vital information. The tension between them crackled in the air as Stokes continued his approach. Calloway could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Take the shot and eliminate the threat, or stay hidden and wait for the right moment to confront him. But before Calloway could make his choice, Stokes stopped, his head turning slightly as if sensing he was being watched. "Come out, Sergeant," Stokes called, his voice calm and measured. "I know you're there." Calloway's breath hitched. His cover was blown. With a resigned sigh, Calloway stepped out from behind the shed, his gun drawn but pointed toward the ground. Stokes turned to face him, his expression unreadable, though a hint of satisfaction gleamed in his eyes. "I'm surprised you made it this far," Stokes said, his voice laced with something akin to admiration. "Most people wouldn't have lasted this long." "Why are you doing this?" Calloway demanded, his voice hoarse from exhaustion and tension. "What's this all about?" Stokes smiled, that cold, calculated smile that Calloway had come to despise. "You still don't get it, do you? This isn't just about you, it's about Westbrook, about control, power. We've been running this town for years, keeping everything in line. You just happened to stumble into something much bigger than yourself." Calloway's stomach churned. "Who's we? How deep does this go?" Stokes shrugged, as if the answer was too obvious to even bother explaining. "You'll find out soon enough, but for now, I have a proposition for you." Calloway's grip tightened on his gun. "A proposition?" Stokes nodded. "You're a smart man, Sergeant. You've already figured out that you can't trust anyone in this town. But you're also a problem, one we need to control. So here's the deal. Hand over the notebook, and you walk away. You get to live, and we get to keep Westbrook running smoothly." Calloway felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. "You really think I'd take that deal?" Stokes' smile faded, replaced by a look of mild disappointment. "I was hoping you'd see reason, but I suppose I expected too much." The air between them grew heavy with the weight of the confrontation. Calloway knew there was no way out of this that didn't end in violence. He couldn't give up the notebook, not after everything he had learned. But Stokes wasn't going to let him walk away. Stokes took a step forward, his hand moving toward his own weapon. "It's a shame, Sergeant. You really could have been useful." Calloway's muscles tensed, his instincts screaming at him to act. In a split second, he raised his gun, and before Stokes could react, he fired. The shot rang out through the woods, and Stokes staggered back, clutching his shoulder. A look of shock and rage flashed across his face, but Calloway didn't wait for him to recover. He bolted, sprinting through the trees with everything he had left in him. Behind him, he heard Stokes' voice, low and furious. "You're making a mistake, Calloway. You can't outrun this." But Calloway didn't stop. His lungs burned, his legs ached, but he kept running, driven by the desperate need to escape. The notebook thumped against his chest with every step, a reminder of the truth he carried with him. As he broke through the tree line and reached the edge of the highway, Calloway slowed, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked back toward the woods, half expecting to see Stokes emerging, but the forest was still. For now, he was safe. But the danger wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Sergeant Calloway leaned against a tree, catching his breath as the distant hum of passing cars on the highway filled the air. He was on the outskirts of Westbrook now, far from the reach of Stokes and the men hunting him. But the weight of the notebook in his jacket reminded him that his work wasn't done. He pulled out his phone, the message from earlier still on the screen. "Trust no one. They're everywhere." The warning felt more urgent now than ever. He couldn't go to his department. He couldn't go to anyone in Westbrook. Stokes had made it clear that the corruption ran deep, deeper than Calloway had ever suspected. The town was compromised, but he had the key to unraveling it. The notebook held everything he needed to expose the truth, but getting it into the right hands was going to be a challenge. Calloway scrolled through his contacts, searching for someone, anyone, outside of Westbrook who might be able to help. His mind raced as he considered his options. The state police? Maybe, but they could be compromised too. The FBI? He'd need solid proof before they'd get involved, and even then, there was no guarantee they'd act fast enough. Then, he thought of her, Claire Stevens, an investigative journalist he'd met years ago while working a case. She was tough, relentless, and most importantly, she had no ties to Westbrook. If anyone could blow this wide open, it was her. With shaky hands, Calloway dialed her number. The phone rang once, twice, and then a voice answered, Claire Stevens. "Claire, it's Calloway," he said, his voice strained. "I need your help." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when she spoke again, her tone was cautious. "Calloway, it's been a while. What's going on?" I can't explain everything right now, but I'm in serious trouble. I've uncovered something big: corruption, conspiracy. It's all in Westbrook, and it goes deep. I have evidence, but I need someone I can trust to help me get it out." Another pause. Calloway could almost hear the wheels turning in her head. "You're not messing with me, are you?" "Believe me, I wish I was," Calloway said grimly. "But this is real. I've got the proof in my hands." "All right," she said finally. "Where do we meet?" Calloway exhaled, a wave of relief washing over him. He gave her the location, a diner just outside the Westbrook city limits. It was a neutral spot, far enough from the town to avoid suspicion, but close enough for them to meet quickly. "I'll be there in an hour," Claire said before hanging up. Calloway slid the phone back into his pocket, his mind spinning with the gravity of what he was about to do. He was putting everything on the line: his career, his safety, even his life. But he had no other choice. As he walked toward the highway, his thoughts kept drifting back to the notebook and the secrets it contained. The people of Westbrook deserved to know the truth, and Calloway was determined to make sure they did. The road ahead was long, and the fight wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, Calloway felt a glimmer of hope. He was no longer running. He was fighting back. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, share it with others, and let us know your thoughts or experiences in the comments below. Your voice matters.